everyone, and welcome to Novara Live. I'm your host, Dalia Gebrial, and I'll be joined later by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Coming up tonight, Britain's equality watchdog has said that the NHS should no longer allow trans people on single-sex wards. Dockworkers in France have successfully blocked a shipment of fighter jet parts to Israel, and we'll look at the Chinese influencers who are taking on Trump's trade war. Israel, it appears, isn't satisfied with the destruction, instability, and mass death it's causing in pursuit of its own ongoing genocide in Gaza, nor with the mass displacement and repression it's enforcing in the West Bank. It now emerges that the country wanted to open a new and even more incendiary front in its several-pronged quest to dominate the wider region. The New York Times reports that Israel had made imminent plans to launch an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, but they were halted after US President Donald Trump withheld his approval. The Times reports this. Israeli officials had recently developed plans to attack Iranian nuclear sites in May. They were prepared to carry them out and at times were optimistic that the United States would sign off. The goal of the proposals, according to officials briefed on them, was to set back Tehran's ability to develop a nuclear weapon by a year or more. Almost all of the plans would have required US help, not just to defend Israel from Iranian retaliation, but also to ensure that an Israeli attack was successful, making the United States a central part of the attack itself. Now, Trump ran his campaign on the promise to bring the US's involvement in foreign wars to an end. And while that pledge hasn't lessened his administration's support for Israel, it does appear to have influenced Trump's decision when it comes to Iran. The Times goes on to report this. In a meeting this month, one of several discussions about the Israeli plan, Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, presented a new intelligence assessment that said the buildup of American weaponry could potentially spark a wider conflict with Iran that the United States did not want. A range of officials echoed Mrs. Gabbard's concerns in the various meetings, and Susie Wiles, the White House Chief of Staff, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and Vice President J.D. Vance all voiced doubts about the attack. And those doubts appear to have won out, with Trump's administration instead secretly pursuing negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program. Just 10 days ago, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited the White House, and according to the Times, Netanyahu's priority was to get US sign-off on Israel's Iran attack plan. Instead, this is what happened.
We're having direct talks with Iran, and they've started. It'll go on Saturday. We have a very big meeting, and we'll see what can happen. And I think everybody agrees that doing a deal would be preferable to doing the obvious. And the obvious is not something that I want to be involved with, or frankly, that Israel wants to be involved with if they can avoid it. So we're going to see if we can avoid it.
Now, obviously, we're not in the brain of, alhamdulillah, thank God we're not in the brains of Trump and Netanyahu in that moment. What a hideous place. But so we don't know if Netanyahu knew that Trump was going to make such an announcement in front of the press with him sitting next to him like that, because even though Trump says there, Israel doesn't want to get involved in a conflict with Iran. We pretty much know that Netanyahu is very much wanting to get involved in some direct confrontation with Iran. He has said as much publicly for a while now. And the fact that Trump, we don't know if Trump and Netanyahu had discussed that before, but it kind of looked from Netanyahu's reaction there, from him just sort of suddenly perking up and just being like, wait, what? That basically Trump had paraded him in front of the press to basically announce to him there that your public line, I'm going to publicly undermine your line in front of the press, and you're going to hear about that possibly for the first time with a million cameras in your face. If there's one thing about Trump that we could say, it's that he is loyal to no one but Trump. In this occasion, it actually was quite enjoyable to watch though. But yeah, I do wonder if Netanyahu knew that Trump was going to say something like that there and then. He certainly looked like it had taken him by surprise. So Netanyahu's Iran attack plan appears to be in the bin for now. and substantive talks do now seem to be going ahead between the US and Iran over Tehran's nuclear program. Officials from the two countries held talks in Oman last week, described as positive by Iran's foreign minister. And a second round of talks will now take place in Rome this weekend, also mediated by Oman. Meanwhile, head of the International Atomic Energy Association, Rafael Mariano Grossi, arrived in Iran yesterday, warning that the US-Iran nuclear talks are at a crucial stage. Speaking to Le Monde before traveling to Iran, Grossi said this about how near the country was to developing a nuclear warhead. Although Iran possesses enough material to produce not just one but several bombs, it does not yet have nuclear weapons. It's like a puzzle. They have the pieces and they could eventually put them together one day. There is still a way to go before achieving that. But they are not far off. It must be acknowledged. In the past 4 years, there has been a very sustained acceleration on Iran's part in this area. Now, nuclear weapons are existentially dangerous for the human race, and fewer rather than more countries should have them. So the prospect of a positive outcome to peaceful negotiations over the Iranian nuclear weapons program is in everyone's best interests. Everyone, except that is for Israel, who have long sought regime change in the Islamic State and a breakdown of Iran's support for the various groups resisting Israeli occupation and oppression. And disruption in Iran is also key to Israel's ongoing destabilization of the region, which includes continuing attacks on its neighbors. Despite a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel coming into force late last year, the UN has reported that 71 civilians have been killed in Lebanon as a result of Israeli strikes since the deal came into force. Many of them have taken place in the country's south, but late last month, Israeli bombs hit the country's capital, Beirut, too, destroying a building and forcing the evacuation of nearby schools. At the beginning of this month, there was another strike on the capital, intensifying fears amongst residents of a return to an all-out war. Israel also continues to occupy territory in southern Lebanon, refusing to withdraw from several areas despite the ceasefire. Meanwhile, in neighboring Syria, Israel has continued to target the country's military infrastructure, bombing assets like tanks, missile launchers, and personal carriers. Earlier this month, Israel also attacked Hama airport in Syria, reportedly killing 10 people. And the strikes have caused rising tensions between Israel and other nations in the region. The Arab League has called Israel's actions in Syria reckless and has accused Israel of attempting to destabilize the region while demanding that the, quote, Israeli war machine come to a stop. Meanwhile, Turkey has warned Israel that its continuing raids across Syria are weakening the ability of the new government led by Ahmed al-Sharaa to counter threats from Islamic State. The EHRC, Britain's equalities watchdog, has said the NHS should no longer allow trans people in single-sex wards that align with their gender identity. If taken on, this means that trans men will be forced to be treated on women's wards and trans women on men's wards. The British Transport Police have also updated their guidelines to state that trans officers can no longer conduct searches on people who share their gender, meaning this means trans men officers will conduct searches on women and trans women officers on men. Both moves follow the landmark Supreme Court ruling that a woman is only defined by biological sex. This means that trans women, even those with a gender recognition certificate, will not have protections under the Equalities Act as women. Now, the ruling has triggered a wave of uncertainty as various institutions and campaigners try to decipher what the ruling will mean in practice. Yet within that uncertainty, the EHRC has been a strong voice in support of enforcing the ruling to its fullest extent. And partly that is because of this woman. This is Baroness Faulkner, the chair of the EHRC, and she has long been an advocate of, quote, single-sex spaces, i.e. restricting access to women's spaces and services to cis women alone. Now, this is significant because the EHRC is responsible for enforcing the Equalities Act on public bodies. And it has made clear under the leadership of Baroness Faulkner that public bodies like the NHS will be pursued if their guidance is not updated by summer to reflect the ruling. This was Faulkner on Radio 4 Today.
In the event, though, that the campaigners who won their case yesterday, the ones who you supported 4 years ago, say, right, we're now going to carry on this fight. We are going to go to law. Will they get the support of the Equality and Human Rights Commission? Do you want to now pursue organisations, public bodies and others who you think are still not preserving women's rights?
Nick, we're going to have a new statutory code of practice. Statutory meaning it'll be the law of the land. It'll be interpreted by courts as the law of the land. We're hopefully going to have that by the summer. If we're responsible for 9 protected characteristics, not only these 3, in other words, sex, gender reassignment, and sexual orientation, there's 6 others. We evaluate when the law is not being followed, and we make a case-by-case decision as to whether to have conversations, to use a bigger rod, to use enforcement, compliance tools, or whatever. We will be continuing to do that.
The law is one of those tools. Let's talk about another area that people worry about, which is the health service. Access to women-only wards, for example. Again, what worries some people, not just those who are trans women themselves, but people who worry about them being treated with dignity and respect is, well, where do they get treated? Now, are you saying that the health service may not have trans women on women's wards?
We've been speaking to the health service for actually an inordinately long time, and they keep telling us they're going to produce new guidance. I think we will now be asking them when they expect to produce that new guidance. They now have clarity. There is no confusion as of yesterday at 10:30 in the morning. They can start to implement the new legal reasoning and produce their exceptions forthwith.
But they have to change it, do they? Because they have a document, the NHS guidance, that says trans people should be accommodated according to the way they dress, their name, their pronouns. That is no longer the case. That has to change.
Yes, that's correct.
And you will pursue it if it doesn't change?
Yes, we will. We will be having conversations with them to update that guidance.
So, Faulkner there confirming that the EHRC will use the tools it has at its disposal, including legal ones, to pursue organisations it feels has not adequately integrated this ruling. Here she is discussing other concrete implications of the verdict.
Well, let's try and get some clarity now as to what's going to happen in future. We know you're going to issue guidance. You can't tell us everything now, but let's go through some of the issues that concern people most. Sport. Perhaps the most contentious, perhaps the easiest for you to resolve. The president of World Athletics, Sebastian Coe, welcomes this. Is it simple now that trans women cannot take part in women's sport? Those born as men can't take part in women's sport?
Yes, it is. The ruling is enormously consequential, and it does bring clarity. That is undoubtedly the case. It's a very readable judgment, and organisations should be taking care to read it and to understand that it does bring clarity, helps them decide what they should do. So yes, sport, that is correct. That is a correct interpretation.
And for changing rooms, the debate about whether a trans woman can go into a women's changing room, clear again, is it? No is the answer.
Yes, single-sex services, like changing rooms, must be based on biological sex. If a male person is allowed to use a women-only service or facility, it isn't any longer single-sex. Then it becomes a mixed-sex space. But I have to say, there's no law that forces organizations, service providers, to provide a single-sex space. And there is no law against them providing a third space, an additional space.
Now, trans organisations have already come out and said that enforcing this ruling will not be as simple as Faulkner makes it out to be. That in practice, trans people may now be unable to access spaces or services associated with any gender. And Robinson put this to Faulkner.
Well, let's come to toilets, because toilets is often one that people, let's be honest, get in quite a lather about. We heard there just a few seconds ago from Jane Fay saying there's a real danger that trans people can't go into any toilet at all now. They're not able as trans women to use a women's toilet, but they wouldn't be welcome in a man's toilet if they're wearing a dress, just to make it explicit. What's your answer to trans people who are worried about that?
Well, there isn't, first of all, there isn't any law saying that you cannot use a neutral third space.
I think it's really interesting that Baroness Faulkner and all the people who are defending this ruling are coming out and saying, this is so simple. You heard there Baroness Faulkner saying, there's no confusion now. We have complete clarity. This ruling, let's go and implement it now. It's all so clear. And not acknowledging the significant amount of fallout and complication that is going to arise for trans people as a result, and not just for trans people, quite frankly, but for anyone who does not fit a really narrow idea of what we expect a man to look like or a woman to look like. First of all, how do you actually enforce this without having to get involved in some pretty invasive conversations that fundamentally you can't really prove unless you actually look at someone's birth certificate? But also, as was pointed out there, where Nick Robinson was referencing a conversation with Jane Fay, who we have interviewed, who will show you an interview with her in a few minutes, whereby someone who has been living as a trans woman their whole life, or has been living as a trans man in their whole life, the idea that they are then going to go and use a bathroom or use a changing room, or if they want to be an athlete, that they have to enter competitions that are associated with the gender, with, the sex that they were assigned at birth, then the fact that that would be so patently absurd, the way that Faulkner is saying that we should resolve that glaring contradiction of this ruling is that trans people who make up 0.5% of the population should use their advocacy powers, what advocacy powers? I mean, there wasn't even any trans people involved in the court case. So this idea that trans people have this overwhelming amount of representation and power to get what they want, to get what they advocate for, is absurd. But they're saying that a group of people that make up 0.5% of the population should basically, it's on them now to lobby, to rewire the entirety of social infrastructure to ensure that any gendered activity or gendered space has a third neutral, genderless version. So anywhere where you have gendered changing rooms, anywhere where you have gendered toilets, anything where you have a separation according to gender, like sports competitions, like healthcare, whatever, that it's up to trans people now to intervene in that, use their overwhelming amount of political and legal and social power to basically say that you need to create a third space for us, or a third whatever for us. I mean, it's absurd, and it is tantamount to the erasure of trans people in public life, because they aren't able to participate in the spaces and infrastructures and, organizations that currently exist. They have to just create their own ones. And if they aren't able to do that, then just stay at home, basically, is the message that we can see here. Speaking of the interview that I told you about earlier, I spoke to Jane Fay, who is a director of Transactional UK, and I began by asking her what the response amongst trans right campaigners has been so far.
Yesterday, I would say that it was absolute despair. I'm always very loath to admit that, because there are people out there, particularly from the anti-trans, and from many of those who supported this court case, who will take us owning up despair as somehow or other a success because of the cruelty. But despair, I was going on various forums, and tears, and people saying they're in bits, and frankly, the community was devastated because people had been thinking it could be bad, it could be good. But in the end, this was worse, I think, than the worst we had anticipated.
The EHRC, which is the body, of course, responsible for enforcing the Equalities Act, which is what this ruling addressed, it has thrown its full institutional backing behind this ruling, saying that public bodies must update their guidance at pace. That's their phrasing. What are the risks of rushing through changes associated with the Supreme Court ruling?
For the EHRC today to be saying, adapt to it at pace, I would say creates risks for businesses, because we're still sort of operating. We're in a vaguely twilight world now. And therefore, where do we go next? I think to de-risk a business, wait for the EHRC guidance to come out. I'm sure it's going to be bad for trans people. I don't think they're suddenly going to go, damn it all, we think trans people are lovely after all. But I think they need to wait for that guidance. They need to wait for Parliament to adopt that guidance, which I would guess would be about July. So there's a 3-month window. What's the risk in those 3 months? On the one hand, a cis person might go, you made me share with a trans woman, I'm suing you. I can't give legal advice. The counter risk is a trans woman going, you kicked me out of that loo, I'm suing you. I do not know in the next 3 months which way that case would fall, frankly. It would probably fall differently once EHRC guidance was published.
So the EHRC are insisting that trans people will remain a protected characteristic under the Equalities Act. What do you make of this? I mean, can this realistically be balanced against the ruling today?
Trans people present a conundrum, which then sometimes gets parlayed up into a zero-sum game. Oh, more rights for trans people means less rights for this group, and so on. I don't think it is necessarily as simplistic as that, because for decades, public opinion has been pretty much, who cares? Because it's not a reason for granting us rights, but we're a small minority, so we don't impact largely. And there is no evidence that we cause harm, danger, whatever. This is a very, very targeted and picky campaign. Now, the reason we had the law as it was that 20 years ago, the UK was regularly being taken to the European Court, losing cases, being threatened with massive fines increasingly, because it had left trans people in a legal limbo. Therefore, the government passed the Gender Recognition Act, and yesterday's ruling, most of the lawyers I've spoken to say yesterday's ruling puts a hole, that the Gender Recognition Act is holed below the surface. It no longer really has any force. Therefore, that puts us back to prior to that. You won't see cases immediately, because cases will only come forward if they go forward to Strasbourg, to the European Court, and they have to exhaust all UK processes first. So if somebody starts a case today, 4 or 5 years to get to Europe, eventually the cases will get there. Eventually, I think government will be pushed back into shape, although by then, God knows what sort of government we'll have. Perhaps they'll want to leave the European Court. The thing about you've not lost any rights, that is just window dressing. If you look at the full-on list of human rights, the right to be able to pretty much live your life in peace, to enjoy your family life, to enjoy your privacy and so on, that is totally now gone. So the Equality Act provides a very narrow protection against some specific discrimination. What this ruling has done is effectively take away all but the most basic rights around employment discrimination from us. But the question The original question is, how does society make room for trans people, given there are always going to be people who object to our presence? In some ways, it's no different from any other minority. There are going to be people who object to the presence of travellers in the room. Do we now start to say, well, yeah, some people object to that? There are people who object to non-white people in the room. Are we going to start taking notice of that? So the dangerous precedent is that the principle adopted here is if one group, which is probably technically not a minority, but it's a disadvantaged class, women, objects to another minority, then they get dibs on who stays and who goes. And once you bring in that principle, where does it end? And when they say, you've still got rights, I've got a right to breathe. Aren't I lucky?
So, I mean, as you mentioned, of course, there's been a lot of despair about what this could mean for trans people. But now that we're the day after the ruling, what are some concrete actions that the trans rights movement are looking to take in response to this ruling?
First and foremost, are parliamentary. I do not think most previous Labour governments would have gone along with this, particularly as what this has done is gutted two pieces of Labour legislation, the Equality Act and the Gender Recognition Act. But over and over and over, what I am hearing, is this government going backward on what previously would have been considered to be core values around almost tolerance and, dare I say it, niceness in society. I was asked today, how did we get here? And a large part of how we got here, I can describe the mechanisms and the political steps, is to do with a coarsening of public discourse, which maybe started with Trump, maybe started with Brexit, certainly goes on when people start saying, oh, asylum seekers, they've drowned, hooray. Or as I heard on a BBC programme the other day, it was a phone-in, we need to be dehumanising our violent prisoners the way they're doing in El Salvador. I mean, the values, the coarsening, the nastiness, that's a part of it. So one road forward is somehow bringing society back into balance. One road forward is for Parliament to grow up, and I'm not sure if I'm allowed to use the word, but to get some B*********, LS, you know what I mean? Because they could they won't, I know they won't, they could throw out whatever regulations the Baroness brings forward. Indeed, when they first came into power, apparently they were planning to remove the Baroness, but then their replacement couldn't take over, so they said, oh, all right, you can stay for another year. And the other avenue, which is a much longer avenue, is legal, but that requires exhausting, as I said, all avenues of law in the UK, and therefore you lose a case, lose another case, lose another case, and after losing about 3 or 4 cases, you then go to Supreme Court and say, excuse me, can I take this to Strasbourg? And you take it to Strasbourg. Probably Strasbourg, I can't say, but probably Strasbourg will give a different view. It's almost certainly impossible to appeal this case to Strasbourg. So this case is done and dusted. So unless there is a case already in the system that is close to appeal or Supreme Court level, it's 4 or 5 years now to get this back through legal routes. So there is no short-term fix, and trans people are now pretty much reconciled to living a very, very reduced life. And I'm going to make one other comment there, perhaps to end on. People have talked about the legal consequences and political consequences. What we know, when leading politicians, judges, whatever, come out with hateful rhetoric, it converts on the streets to actual nastiness, actual violence. So we fully expect to see this ruling ending in violence against trans people. And the comment that the judges made bear in mind they had no input from trans people in this judgment. Saying that this will not disadvantage trans people at all is either supremely ignorant or they're just lying.
That was Jane Fay from Transactional speaking to me earlier today. I think it's worth also, as Jane did there, putting this into the context of a broader rise of the far right and what the rise of the far right is being grounded in. It's being grounded in two things. First of all, taking things that are really complex and really knotty and really multifaceted and pretending that there's a really, really simple solution to it. So the question of what is gender? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man? What is this thing called gender? And acting like it's really, really simple. This is what women are. This is what men are. This is what women do. This is what men do. This is how women act, what they wear, the jobs they do, the work they do, and also for men. And acting like that's a really simple, fixed thing and legislating that, not just with the law, but also the knock-on effects of these kinds of campaigns, which, as Jane points out, goes down to street violence, regulating that into existence. So that's one thing. Another thing is rolling back rights that we have considered to be established. We're seeing this in the US, obviously, with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, with the revoking of people's green cards. It's long been an established principle that if you have a green card, you essentially have the same rights as a citizen. That precedent has almost overnight just been undermined. In this country now, we are seeing the idea that a gender recognition certificate is meaningful is a right that has been established since 2002, a right that has been gained. Like all of these rights that have been enshrined, they have been gained because a lot of people put a lot on the line, often as a consequence of experiencing significant amounts of violence and oppression, that people mounted campaigns to enshrine those rights. And we consider those rights to be settled issues, right? And now, overnight, those rights are being overturned. And the one thing I'm going to say is you might not be in that 0.5% of people that are trans. You might not know anyone who is in that 0.5% of the population that are trans. But the rights that you rely on, that you consider to be established, that you consider to be sacred and settled, are all now potentially under question. And this is a very significant turning point for the consolidation of far-right politics, for the rise of a far-right politics right now. And it always starts with a group of people that the vast majority of the population don't feel heavily staked in, or have been made to not feel heavily staked in, because that's the easiest way to set precedent for rollbacks that are going to happen later down the line. Helena, lots of shock yesterday. We've now had 24 hours to kind of sit and look at what this might mean. And we've had these sort of very early interventions from the EHRC, which, to me, the main message has been emphasizing speed. We got to get this implemented quickly, as if it's all so simple. I mean, what do you make of the EHRC's interventions following this ruling?
Well, I did say on yesterday's show with Michael that the thing that would make me want to leave the country would be a blanket ban on access to the correct spaces, and that's what the EHRC have handed down. So the immediate thing I did this morning was look on ways to leave the country, go to Spain, Greece, wherever these rights are protected, and find a way to get citizenship, which is of course very difficult now that we're outside the European Union. So thanks, Brexiteers. I appreciate it. And what this is the end of a very long campaign from very well-financed backed people to try and eradicate the existence of trans people in public life. That has been the goal for a long time. We remember Michael Knowles at CPAC, I believe it was in 2023, saying the goal was to eradicate transgenderism from public life entirely. This is what they wanted, right? You didn't see like exasperated relief outside the court steps from the supporters from the gender critical side at the start of this case, once the verdict was reached. It was celebrations. They were popping champagne. It's not cheap champagne, right? These are people who have lots of money behind their campaigns because it's backed by plenty of rich people and rich organizations who have a vested interest in trying to ensure exactly what you were saying before. It, of course, has had plenty of parliamentary backing. As far as I am concerned, it is my opinion, the Baroness Faulkner was appointed at the head of the EHRC specifically for this purpose, to weaponize and politicize the EHRC, as was described by people who had left the EHRC when she was appointed the chair. They said that the EHRC had turned into a political organization for political ends rather than one that was outside of party politics. And you know that this is at least somewhat plausible because Kemi Badenoch is almost admitted as such. The whole point of getting people like Faulkner in the position that she's in, the whole point of commissioning the Cass review wasn't to get a holistic understanding of where these principles should lie. It was to be able to politically lobby for specifically what we have had today of trying to make it as difficult as possible for trans people to exist in public at all. I mean, this is why when there was a freedom information request into Kemi Badenoch's interactions with people about guidance around trans people, when she said that she'd met with plenty of members of the LGBTQ plus community to discuss these potential changes, when the FOI was done, it was said that she'd literally met with 0 pro-trans groups. She'd met with 2, I believe it was 2, anti-trans groups specifically, and that was it. Those are the only people that she met with, right? There was a political project to put this to the position that it's in, the court cases to get us to this point, all incredibly well funded. And because, of course, they aren't out there to try and be, as I said, in a position of maximized utility. It's because they don't want to live in a society with trans people. They don't want to have to deal with us. They call us a problem for a sane world. To quote somebody from that movement personally, that's the way in which that they think of us is a problem that has to be dealt with rather than people who need places in society. And they want to get rid of us from society. Well, good. Well done then. You've won. Okay, brilliant. I will leave. I will go away and you'll never see me again in society because it's clearly what they want to happen. I wish I could stay and fight, but I don't have any power to be able to fight this. And the people who have the power, as has been pointed out by Jane at that interview, are people at a parliamentary level. And whereas we should have a Labour Party that is in interest of social justice, but we don't. We have a Labour Party that is fundamentally conservative, which has embraced anti-trans positions almost entirely at this point, given the people that they've wheeled out to welcome this decision and entirely lie on the gender critical side of this argument, despite there being LGBTI Labour or whatever it is and all of the failures that they've done to try and move the position and move the dial on this, where any other Labour administration would never be in this position. And so given even within their own manifesto, they said they would make the gender transition process easier. That's been ditched. They've essentially got elected on a false premise. Well, the Labour Party's lied again. What a bloody surprise to literally anyone who's been paying any attention to what this disgusting Labour Party is like nowadays. So essentially, given that their large majority have basically no recourse, as far as I can see, in terms of getting any overturning of this. Again, there's the potential of going to the European Court of Human Rights, but that's going to be something that's way down the line. And we're now looking at the position where Baroness Faulkner will get people to update the guidance immediately, and then suddenly I can't go to the pub anymore. Like, I mean, that's house arrest, essentially, if I can't interact properly with public spaces. I can go to my local game store because they're trans inclusive, but unless I check ahead for every single space I'm going to go into in public, how the hell am I supposed to exist in society now? This is, again, I just want to leave. I just want to leave and never come back to this country anymore.
Yeah, I can't say I don't sympathise with that, to be honest. I think that the point that you make, especially about like just the scenes of like people popping champagne like outside of that verdict, when like people, an already quite vulnerable group, have just been made like significantly more vulnerable by this ruling that you have been fighting for, for all this time. I mean, it's just like, how is your life going to change now? Like, I know this is to the cis women who are so heavily invested in this campaign. I mean, okay, great now. So now gender recognition certificates don't mean anything. Trans people have been chased out of public life. They can't comfortably use changing rooms, gyms, swimming pools, whatever. Is your life better now? Like, have your bills come down? Have you, do you get to see your friends more? Are you like happier in your job? Like, in what material way has your life improved now that you've got what you want? All you've done is chased a minority out of public life. And the great sort of hypocrisy of this, I mean, it always is the case that, you know, every accusation is an admission, that they accuse the trans lobby, which is the thing that they always like to pull out of the bag. They accuse the trans lobby of being this, you know, minority group with minority interests that have this incredibly inflated, you know, power legislatively, politically, socially, whatever. And they're weaponizing that power to force their agenda on, you know, people who don't want that. When the reality is, like, until this very concerted campaign to demonize trans people really escalated over the past sort of 5 to 10 years, this was not a headline issue. Like, this was not, in fact, I would say that trans people were able to exist in public life on television and all of this in a way that was a lot less controversial than it seems to be now. This was placed as a wedge issue, fueled by significant amounts of money. The number of people who really cared about this issue in this way is very, very small. And yet they have held the courts, the political system. Every time I post anything, every time I go on media or anything, I have people in my mentions asking me what a woman is. It's like they've held the public conversation hostage until they get this like very particular issue that no one organically is that like invested in, to get that into like, in it, to make that become like this number one topic that everyone has to have an opinion on, and everyone has to feel really, really strongly about. And it's just like, they then are saying that trans people have all this power when trans people didn't even have the power to shape a verdict that is going to so directly impact their lives. And this idea that like trans people have this overwhelming power, well, you've now chased them out of public life. Apparently you've gotten everything you've ever wanted. And I just hope that you're happy now. I really don't understand the obsession. I don't understand the fixation on this issue. And now that it's gone through, the only people that are really going to suffer are trans people, a group of people that already were facing a lot of erasure and a lot of dispossession. But yeah, Helena, any more thoughts?
I think that you going back to the point that you made about are your bills any cheaper now? This is kind of what the Americans have found with electing Donald Trump. They elected him because eggs were too expensive. The private burger taxi was too expensive. Has any of that been fixed? Well, it's only really gotten worse. And it stands to reason that I think that a lot of the people who have been kind of aggressive in their campaigning on this issue, from the gender critical side especially, are people who don't have any real problems, from what I can see. Management consultants and lawyers and people like that who have plenty of money and who are not affected by the sharp end of the cost of living crisis. When you actually look at the vast majority of the population, there was some polling out today from More in Common that showed that the biggest issue facing people at 64% was the cost of living. Around about 40-something% was the NHS. Around 30% was migration. Do you want to know what the percentage was for people who cared about the debate around trans people? 2%. Right? If this is all of your life, if this is something that so affects you that you're celebrating with popping champagne about demonizing a minority of people, then you need to get some real fucking problems. I'm sorry. I mean, again, like the consequences for the people that you've attacked here are devastating, and all that's done is give people some kind of, as far as I can see, some pretty sadistic sense of joy at being able to stamp on a group that they feel superior to, and that they don't want to share a society with. But in reality, for most people on the ground, for the vast majority of people in this country, this is completely meaningless to them because, of course, they never cared about it in the first place. And that's why they've never been engaged with the issue to the extent at which 98% of the country don't even think that it's a problem, or at least a particularly large problem.
Dock workers at a port in Marseille have successfully blocked the shipment of F-35 jets that had been on their way to an Israeli airbase. Local dock workers refused to handle a Maersk cargo ship travelling from the US, stating to the port authorities via their union that they refused to be complicit in genocide. The move came in response to a call from Palestinian trade unions to workers around the world to halt arms shipments and refuse to handle weapons headed to Israel. The ongoing provision of parts for F-35 jets to Israel by countries like Australia, Canada, Denmark, the UK, and the US has been criticised heavily by human rights lawyers and campaigners. More than 200 organizations have called on jet-building nations to halt their supply to Israel on the basis that they could not prove such planes were not being used to violate international law. Many of these countries, including the UK, are currently facing legal action on the basis that by providing Israel with essential components of F-35 jets, they are complicit with war crimes. This is not the first time dock workers and activists have blocked arms shipments to Israel. Last year, dock workers in Greece blocked the shipment of an ammunition-filled container on its way to Israel. In India, workers at 11 major ports declared they would refuse to operate shipments carrying weapons to Israel. In Melbourne, activists blocked access to an Israeli cargo ship for 4 days. And even in the US, a military ship docked at the port of Oakland was protested and blocked by campaigners. I'm joined now by Nadia Tannous, International Coordinator for the Mask Off Mess campaign and a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement. Nadia, could you tell us a little bit more about this action by the dock workers?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. The dock workers in Marseille and Fos in the south of France got wind that the Nexoe Maersk, which is part of a larger fleet that is a fleet of feeder vessels, goes around the Mediterranean and is part of the F-35 supply chain to Israel, was destined again to dock in their ports. They were very, very clear that they were absolutely against managing and offloading any sort of weapons or military components. Maersk actually released a statement stating that there were no weapons on this ship. And we know that this is something that they have used time and time again since the launch of the Mask Off Maersk campaign in April of last year, to say that they do not actually handle weapons or ship weapons to conflict zones. This is military cargo. Maersk is much smarter than to send completed weapons in one shipment. What they do is actually kind of produce small pieces and ship different pieces along the same supply chain of the same F-35, for example, or of the Oshkosh tactical vehicle, rocket launchers, rifle cups, things like this. And that then is assembled inside of Israel itself, in the case of the F-35 at the Nevatim Air Base, which is the number one location outside of Haifa for these F-35 components that are then put together and used to conduct a genocide against the people of Gaza. Israel at present has 40 F-35s in their fleet, and they're in the process of trying to create 10 more this next year. For people of Fos and the dock workers in the south of France, once they realized that there were components that were being sent to Nevatim, took a stand. They decided to not cross the Palestinian picket line that was so clearly put forward by the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions last year and again this year, calling on dock workers around the world and unions around the world to not handle military cargo or any sort of supplies destined for Israel that would contribute to the genocide of the Palestinian people.
So there have been quite a few instances now of workers and activists disrupting the supply chain of arms at ports, but also at factories, particularly here in the UK. There's been targets of factories. Do you know, if any, what kind of impact this has been having?
So this has actually been a really important movement that has punctuated the last 18 months. And as we know, has a much longer history, which I'll get into a bit later. Let's say November of 2024, two ships, the Denver and the Seletar, were turned away from the port of Algeciras in the south of Spain. from docking. And those ships, according to the research that we helped to produce as the Palestinian Youth Movement, were carrying the Oshkosh and Namur tactical vehicles. Both tactical vehicle classes were utilized in multiple war crimes in Gaza, including, if you remember, in the ethnic cleansing and the siege of Jabalia, where multiple Palestinian men and boys were transferred from the Gaza Strip to prisons by the Israelis and tortured. Those were Oshkosh and Namur tactical vehicles of the same class which Maersk was carrying, as well as many other types of components. So through the research that we were able to do leading up to that moment in November of 2024, we actually, and there was an article that was released in The Intercept, we were actually able to make a case to Spain that Maersk was in direct contradiction and a direct violation of their arms embargo. And that had a chain effect where both of these ships were denied from the port of Algeciras by the Spanish government. And in one case, actually, some of that cargo was delayed on its delivery to Israel by 2 months just because of that action alone. And this is a really important example because this is a grassroots action of people of consciousness around the world, also working with workers in their ports and unions and trains, wherever these logistics companies kind of operate. In the case of Maersk, they have a very large supply chain. They're one of the largest logistics companies in the planet. And they're also an industry lead, meaning that when Maersk does something, the rest of the industry follows. So this was an important moment to show a large corporation that has blood on its hands of the Palestinian people, that is profiteering and helping to facilitate the genocide against the Palestinian people through these shipments of weapons components, that actually the people, wherever they are able to take a stand and to interrupt this flow of weapons. This is why we named this campaign part of the People's Arms Embargo, because if the governments won't do it, the people will. In this case, in the case of Spain, the government actually was shocked, I think, by not just 2 ships coming to the port of Algeciras, but actually a record that we were able to produce showing that these ships were coming on a weekly basis, sending similar cargo that was then destined to Israel and utilized in the genocide against the Palestinian people.
And sort of coming off of that, what is the role, the broader role in your view, of trade unions in the Palestine solidarity movement?
Trade unions have a very important role, and they have historically. We're really encouraged by the history of trade unions taking a stand against the genocide and apartheid. So the genocide and the incursion into Vietnam, right? We see the oil and gas embargo in the case of South Africa and the large-scale global organizing against South African apartheid. I myself am here in the Bay Area in Oakland, California. We're really encouraged by the role of the ILWU here in the Port of Oakland historically, which is a mostly Black union and has its record as being the first to actually take a stand against apartheid in South Africa. They've taken some brave stances against the unjust U.S. blockade of Cuba. And there are so many examples of trade unions taking a stand and actually being able to interrupt the flow of commerce, which are the arteries, the veins of empire. I think that the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions coming out of Gaza, again, has been very clear ahead of International Workers' Day, demanding that unions actually not participate in any sort of industry that is uplifting and providing diplomatic or economic cover to the Israeli genocide, and not facilitate the flow of weapons or components to the Israeli state. I think that workers historically have this role, and we're seeing actually how brave they are now. Right as the ship, the Nexoe, which was blocked in Foz, was met with many protests in Barcelona. Actually, we're hearing that in the port of Valencia, this is the route that it's going on its way to Morocco. There were multiple workers in the port of Valencia who refused to work this ship, and in the case of Morocco, we're hearing more and more news every day that Moroccan workers' unions, are refusing to service these Maersk ships, and that they know that they're carrying F-35 components, and they're heading to Casablanca on the 18th. They're heading to Tangier on the 20th, and they're not at all open to being part of a system, logistics and supply chain of weapons and components that they never consented to. I also want to note that Maersk has a long history of not marking dangerous cargo. We have examples of coal or other types of dangerous goods that are later found on Maersk ships. This provides a direct a threat to worker safety. The other is that Maersk is a leader. They are a leader in automation at ports around the world. They are literally leading the charge against workers' jobs and prioritizing the employment of robots. You can see this in the port of Rotterdam, which is the largest port in Europe and used to be one of the largest ports in the world, which is now largely automated. So I think that unions understand that their interests are also the interests of people around the world. So it's not just an ideological idea that workers of the world join hands and unite. This is actually a call for all working people, for all people of conscience to join also in the fight of workers in order to have safe workplace conditions, work with dignity, and to not have to participate and be part of an active, ongoing supply chain of genocide and imperialism in this modern day.
Nadia, thank you so much for joining me today. Helena, briefly, do you have any thoughts on, it's so easy to get sucked into the feeling of powerlessness as things are deteriorating so rapidly, but this is a rare moment of hope, no?
Absolutely. That's the good thing about the fact that there is loads of legal protection for trade unions, right? The protection for workers to organise is enshrined in law, and that's what gives unions so much power. So as long as you have a government who will be able to keep that, protection for you, always able to have access to easy levels of organisation. Not that you can't do that even without those legal protections, but it makes it even easier to do so. Because at the end of the day, the fundamental part of capitalism is the totalitarian nature of the workplace, right? Is that your boss gets to decide, the board of directors and who appoint their CEO, they get to decide what the role of your company should be that you work in, what your work is there to do and what it's there to facilitate. And of course, having access to a trade union, having access for shared worker power is a way of being able to exercise control over your workplace to ensure that it fits the broad utility of what you believe that business should be able to do. Of course, I believe in the workers owning the means of production. I believe that every workplace should be owned by the workers, so that they can make their own collective conscious decision to do what's necessary for them to be able to achieve the best utilitarian ends. But in the absence of that, you have to have worker organisation. Otherwise, you're entirely bound to whether or not your boss, whoever they are, wants to support a genocide, or whether they want to be complicit in war crimes or in imperialism or whatever it is. That is the broad role of collective organising within a workplace, is to ensure that it fits what is necessary for you to put your labour into. It is a way of reversing that level of alienation that allows every decision to be made for you by your boss, right? That's the fundamental power of work organisation. And it being put to such good use, as we're seeing with regards to what's happening in direct stopping of military arms and military aid to Israel via people like Dockworkers. But in terms of secondary picketing, you can indeed halt the entirety of the flow of commodities from business to business. For example, you look at the Tesla strike in Sweden, where it's not just a specific group of Tesla workers striking against Tesla, striking against Elon Musk, trying to enforce poor business practice, but there are secondary pickets happening from dock workers and postal workers to back up that strike too. It is not just internal to that singular workplace. A network of workplaces are able to do those things where those secondary picketing laws are in place, right? So there's not just collective in terms of the individualized workplaces themselves, but throughout the broader collective trade union movement. That is a way of being able to bring people together, to be able to have a common cause, to be able to affect overall political change without there necessarily having to be a change at the ballot box.
Exactly. That's why Thatcher went after the unions. Just saying. So there's a huge outpouring of support for you, Helena, in the chat. People don't want to see you go, but also understand why you're feeling the way that you do. I think a lot of us, I'm not a trans woman, but I can't say that I don't feel quite similarly because I know where this is going. We have a comment here from Vegan Barnsley, 1999. We're going to call that 20 quid. And their comment says, trans solidarity, don't let them divide us, stand together. I quite agree. If you're a TikTok user, you might have recently noticed a unique response from Chinese users to US President Donald Trump's trade war with the country.
Some say as long as there's a tag saying made in China, the bag can never be luxury. However, in fact, more than 80% of the luxury bags in the world are made in China. But those luxury brands just won't acknowledge that. They take almost finished bags from China factories back to their own countries and just do the repackaging and logo installing, something like that. That way, the bags will appear at their boutiques as made in Italy or made in France. You know, those sophisticated European countries, which make you feel mysterious, royal, and thus luxury. Now, close your eyes. Let's just do a little, very easy experiment in your head, okay? Imagine that you have Hermes bag and suddenly the label on it changed from made in France into made in China, while everything else like leathers, zippers, and hardware remain the same. Do you suddenly feel that your bag is not as luxury as before? If you do, that means you have been misled and poisoned by the market campaign of those luxury brands for too long. Welcome to the real world. Now you see, those bags are made in China by our intelligent and diligent Chinese artisans. Let's not be poisoned and misled by the market campaign any longer and be a real person.
I love that. And be a real person. Okay. That's just one of dozens of videos that have flooded TikTok over the last few days, with Chinese manufacturers apparently exposing how reliant luxury and high-end goods companies are on Chinese labor. The makers of the videos are also urging US consumers to bypass the administration's 145% tariffs on Chinese imports. How? By avoiding the high prices of luxury brands made in China but finished in other countries and buying the products direct from Chinese makers instead at a vastly discounted price. Dubbed Trade War Talk, the videos have racked up millions of views, leaving some US TikTokers delighted.
All right, so agreed. None of us are buying from luxury brands anymore. We're getting it straight from the Chinese manufacturers. I'm going to start compiling a list of all of the really good manufacturers of the brands that we really want, and we're going to pay less than we would with the tariffs. So drop in the comments the designer and the company that you found in China that is making that same exact brand. I'll do all the research, I'll find out who's legit, and I will make a list. I will make that list available on my website as soon as I can, but let's see how many people and how many different suppliers we can get here. I want to see Gucci, Louis Vuitton, Christian Louboutin. I want to see them all.
But all is perhaps not as it seems, with luxury companies rushing to contradict the claims of the Chinese manufacturers. Lululemon, Louis Vuitton, and Hermes have all denied that their goods are produced in Chinese factories. But many other high-end brands have so far not responded. Legitimate Chinese manufacturers also usually sign non-disclosure agreements, making it unlikely they'd be advertising their work online. So there's a good chance that the items being advertised on TikTok are fakes and knockoffs. But In reality, there's no way to know, given the famously opaque nature of the supply chain for luxury goods. And whatever the truth, the campaign does seem to have struck a nerve when it comes to the anxieties of ordinary Americans over Trump's trade war, as well as US shoppers' reliance on Chinese exports. And it's opened up greater scrutiny of what exactly makes a bag worth tens of thousands of dollars when it only costs tens of dollars to make.
Does anybody have the Louis Vuitton from China and a Louis Vuitton that they got at the designer store? Because I need to see a side-by-side. I have to know if there's any discrepancies or any differences, or is it the exact same thing? Because I'm starting to feel ripped the fuck off right now. I got a closet full of this shit that I paid thousands for. And you're telling me it's all been made in China and I could have just gone straight to China and gotten this shit? It just can't be the same. It cannot be the same. And if it is, damn, we all got fucking played. Well, not all of us, but a lot of us. Seriously, please don't tell me I got played. I refuse to believe that there's no difference.
It's not just TikTok users taking part in trade war talk. Even members of the Trump administration have found themselves pulled into the campaign to reveal the extent of Chinese goods in the designer market. At the end of January, the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, made this announcement.
I was just with the president in the Oval Office, and I can confirm that tomorrow, the February 1st deadline that President Trump put into place at a statement several weeks ago continues. The president will be implementing tomorrow a 25% tariffs on Mexico, 25% tariffs on Canada, and a 10% tariff on China for the illegal fentanyl that they have sourced and allowed to distribute into our country, which has killed tens of millions of Americans.
Those were the heady days when Trump's trade war was barely even beginning. Now, 25%, that's child's play at this point. But now, you might have noticed there, the dress that Leavitt was wearing in that clip appears to be from a UK-based brand called Self Portrait. And according to the cut, it retails for around $400. But earlier this week, Chinese diplomat Zhang Jinzheng posted this online. Accusing China is business. Buying China is life. The beautiful lace on the dress was recognized by an employee of a Chinese company as its product. Look, the fact is first of all, the luxury goods market is a ripoff. The thing that you are paying for is the feeling of smugness and exclusivity. You're not paying for a level of quality that is the number of degrees better than a bag that's not luxury or designer that the price would suggest. What you're paying for is, the IP, like the intellectual property or the proprietary design that indicates that you have enough money to spend 2, 3, 4 grand on a bag. It's nothing to do with quality. It's nothing to do with utility. It's literally just to do with symbolism. And to me, if you're paying that much for pure symbolism, you're already like de facto being played. And the fact that a lot of the time this is made, the vast amount of the construction of a product is made in the same factories as much cheaper products are made is by the by. And also, oftentimes with a lot of these companies, apparel companies, etc., it's really, really, really difficult to map every single place that garment has been through, because a garment is not made from beginning to end. It's not, the cotton isn't picked, weaved, and sewn in the same place. It's a supply chain that runs throughout the world, and it's often very, very difficult to track. This is why, campaigns that are trying to improve workers' rights throughout the supply chain in the apparel industry have a really difficult time, because it's actually really difficult to trace where all the different elements of a garment come from. So really, the idea that you can disentangle, particularly considering how powerful China is in the supply chain of basically most industries now, it's really difficult to be able to concretely say, this product did not go through China whatsoever. And we're going to find out the true cost of that, the true role of China in the supply chain of basically everything, particularly the Americans use, when these tariffs really come into play. So yeah, we'll see how that pans out. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me, Helena. Not an easy show, but thank you so much.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure to at least share the stage with you, Dalia, as always. So thank you for having me.
Likewise. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Make sure you come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.